Scotland, 1831. Snow drifted over the moors like the petals of a wedding that would never take place. Isla McLaren watched Clydesmore Castle rise against the slate-coloured sky, a looming fortress of stone so dark it seemed to swallow what little winter light remained. Her hands, marked by the harsh Highland winters and by long hours controlling a restless horse, tightened around the green tartan ribbon Grace had embroidered, the ribbon meant for a wedding dress. The dress Grace would never wear. The wind cut through Isla's travel cloak like a cold blade, but she did not pull back. There was something final in that landscape, a silent warning that once she crossed those gates, there would be no return. Grace was dead. Fever had taken her in 3 brutal days, so swift and merciless that Isla had barely understood what had happened, much less grieved it. Now she carried not only mourning, but a lie as heavy as the castle walls before her. No one could know the bride was not Grace McLaren. No one could suspect that the Duke of Clydesmore, a man who, the servants whispered, had locked his heart away the day he found his brother dead, was about to marry the wrong sister. Isla touched the cold ring on her finger, the ring Grace had never felt, and remembered the promise she had made to her father. Peace between the clans and the rights over contested lands depended on this marriage. Her family's survival depended on this marriage, and Isla McLaren, even knowing she was not shaped for titles or courtly corridors, even aware of every flaw that made her unfit for these silent halls, would step into that castle as if she were Grace. She would pretend softness where she was sharp, pretend delicacy where she was storm, pretend until the lie rooted itself, or until the truth destroyed her. The carriage moved forward, and Isla did not look back. There was nothing left behind her. Only an uncertain future, built on the memory of a dead sister, and a promise that might cost her very soul. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like and subscribe and tell me, what city and country are you watching from? I love seeing how far our stories travel. Now, enjoy the story. Isla McLaren had not been raised to become a duchess. She had grown up in the Highlands where life was too harsh for ornament, and truth was often sharper than any blade. While Grace mastered embroidery and played the piano with flawless grace, Isla learned to ride with the daring of a seasoned horseman, even though she knew a young woman of her station was expected to ride side-saddle. Grace had always been the ideal daughter for an arranged marriage to an English duke. Gentle, well-mannered, a beauty that soothed arguments and pleased alliances. But Grace was gone, and on the night her sister's body lay cooling, Isla's father, his face hollowed by despair, his voice splintered by fear, spoke words no father should speak. "You will go in her place. No one needs to know. If the marriage fails, we lose everything." Isla had thought about protesting. She had thought about screaming that she couldn't do it, didn't want to, didn't know how to carry such a lie. But the image of Grace, so fragile on her deathbed, almost swallowed by the pale sheets and the fever burning through her skin, had silenced every word. They were twins, identical in face, inseparable in childhood, different only in the way they lived. And yet, in that cold room where Grace's breathing had become a faint, uneven whisper, Isla felt that a part of herself was dying too. Perhaps, Isla had thought, she could sustain the deception long enough to secure the alliance. Perhaps, once peace was assured, she could finally reveal the truth. But truth had a habit of destroying everything it touched. As the carriage rolled down the snow-covered road to Clydesmore, as the castle loomed ahead with the weight of a sentence, Isla clutched the green ribbon and made the only promise she could trust herself to keep. She would endure. Even if it meant marrying a man who would never truly know her, even if it meant living as the shadow of another, even if it meant never again belonging to herself. The carriage halted before the iron gates. A servant opened the door and bowed. Isla stepped down, feeling the weight of the castle's empty windows watching her like silent eyes. Somewhere within those walls, the Duke of Clydesmore awaited her. She lifted her chin, breathed deeply, and stepped into the lie as one steps onto a battlefield. Chapter 1. The Weight of the Lie. The entrance hall of Clydesmore smelled of candle wax and old, settled loneliness. Isla crossed the dark marble floor, her footsteps echoing beneath the high ceiling painted with faded frescoes. There was an abandoned quality to the castle, not quite ruin, but as if every object had been left to endure on its own. The portraits lining the walls watched her with muted eyes, and the thin layer of dust on the furniture spoke not of neglect, but of mourning. A home carved by a loss no one dared disturb. A severe-faced housekeeper, dressed in black from collar to hem, approached and offered a restrained curtsy. "Milady," she said, and the title, cold and unfamiliar, slid through Isla's chest like a blade. "The Duke awaits you in the library. Should you wish to rest first?" "No," Isla answered, too firmly. She corrected herself a beat late, softening her voice. "Thank you. I would prefer to meet him now." One of the housekeeper's eyebrows lifted, barely, but enough to make Isla's stomach knot. Grace would not have interrupted. Grace would have smiled, tilted her head, and said, "As you wish." Isla pressed the tartan ribbon hidden in her pocket, as though it were a talisman, then followed the woman down the long corridors where aged tapestries swayed in the draughts of cold air. The library was vast, its shelves stretching to the ceiling, its tall windows catching a pale, indifferent winter light. Before the fireplace, where the fire burned low, a man stood with his back to her. His hands were clasped behind him, his posture too straight. Not the posture of a man awaiting a bride, but of a man awaiting a verdict. "Miss McLaren," the housekeeper announced, before stepping back and closing the door with an almost solemn click. He turned slowly. The eyes came first, a brown so dark it was nearly black, intense enough to make her want to glance away. He was younger than Isla had imagined, perhaps 28, with sharply cut features, a controlled expression, and a thin scar running from his temple to his jaw. It was not the scar of a soldier. It hinted at something more intimate, more dangerous. "So it is you," said Rowan Sinclair, Duke of Clydesmore. His voice was low, disciplined, polite enough to hide something beneath. "The bride this dukedom's duties impose upon me." Isla felt the urge to answer with her Highland frankness, but she forced herself to hesitate. Just for a second. Grace would have said something gentle, something conciliatory. "And your Grace is the man." She searched for the right tone, lighter, more demure. "The man with whom my clan hopes to secure peace and protection." It was almost perfect. Almost. But he caught the brief hesitation. A flicker of surprise crossed his eyes, like a spark that died as quickly as it appeared, swallowed again by the rigid mask he seemed trained to wear. "The wedding will take place tomorrow at noon," he said, "as agreed with your father. Therefore, external pressures that require haste." Something in his tone suggested politics, land, and danger. Isla merely nodded. Any greater reaction might betray her. "You will have your chambers prepared and servants assigned to you. All that is expected of a future duchess will be provided." He paused, deliberately. "Everything, except any expectation of affection or intimacy. I will not demand what I am unable to give." It was a blow. Courteous, yes, but a blow nonetheless. The kind of distance a 19th-century man would state with impeccable politeness. Isla should have lowered her gaze, should have murmured something graceful, should have been grace. But Highland blood ran hot. "Then there is no cause for concern, Your Grace," she said before she could stop herself. "For I expect nothing from my future husband that he has no intention of offering." A silence settled. Dense. Electric. Rowan stepped closer. Not enough to breach propriety, but enough for Isla to feel the heat of him, solid as stone. His eyes narrowed, studying her with unsettling intensity. There was no anger there. Not yet. What Isla saw was interest, curiosity, and the first shadow of suspicion. "You are not what I expected," he murmured. "And your Grace," Isla replied, heart thundering in her chest, "is exactly what I was told you would be." A smile touched his lips, not kind, not mocking. The smile of a man who had just discovered an unexpected adversary, and welcomed the challenge. "Welcome to Clydesmore, Miss McLaren." There was something dark in the way he spoke her name, something that made Isla feel the fabric of her lie tighten around her throat. I sincerely hope you survive what you'll find here." He moved away with that same controlled precision, poured himself a glass of Scotch whisky, lifted it in a silent, solitary toast, and left the room without a backward glance. The door closed softly, but the silence that followed fell upon Isla like a weight. She stood alone in the vast chamber of books, the fire dying in the hearth, and knew with a terrible certainty that she had made her first mistake. Not by speaking too boldly, though she had, but because Rowan Sinclair was not a man easily deceived, and Isla McLaren, pretending to be Grace, had already revealed a piece of herself he had begun to notice. The truth lingered in the cold air of the library. He was not a man who forgave easily. And she, impulsive, honest, ill-fitted to this charade, was not certain she could survive her own lie. Chapter 2. The Duke's Gaze. Rowan Sinclair was restless. He stayed in the library long after the fire surrendered to its own weight, collapsing into tired embers. Then he walked through the empty corridors of Clydesmore, as he did every night since inheriting the title. Since the night he had found his brother's body hanging from the beams of the old barn, a crumpled letter on the floor speaking of love, loss, and despair. Since he had learned, violently, that love saved no one. It only destroyed in quieter, crueler ways. But tonight, it wasn't his brother's memory that kept him awake. It was her. The woman they introduced as Grace McLaren. The bride the McLaren clan had sent as part of the agreement. Peace in exchange for marriage, land in exchange for loyalty. Rowan had expected someone gentle, polished, easily shaped. Every letter he had received described Grace as educated, discreet, perfectly suited to be the Duchess he neither had the patience nor the heart to shape. But the woman who walked into his library that afternoon was nothing like that. She had met him head-on, not with open insolence, but with a kind of unsettling courage, like someone who had grown up in a place where no one had ever taught her to lower her eyes. There was something in her manner, something untouched by aristocratic polish, something too real. It bothered him more than he was willing to admit. Rowan stopped before the large window overlooking the inner courtyard, watching the snow fall in heavy, silent flakes, as if the night wished to bury him under its own weight. Something was wrong. He had felt it the instant she crossed the library's threshold. The pieces did not align. Perhaps the reports had been mistaken. Perhaps Grace McLaren was more complex than her father's letters made her appear. Or perhaps, and this thought unsettled him far more, the McLarens were playing a game he had not yet understood. Highland clans were never simple. Rowan had been educated in Edinburgh and London, trained for the politics of drawing rooms, not the cunning of the mountains. He knew that clan alliances were rarely what they appeared to be. Desperation disguised as diplomacy, that was always the trap. The door creaked softly, and Mrs. Abernathy, Clydesmore's housekeeper for nearly 3 decades, appeared holding a small candle. Her shadow stretched across the floor like a quiet reminder of a home that had lost its joy. "Your Grace should rest," she said. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Rowan did not turn. "Tell me what you observed of her," he said. "The bride." Mrs. Abernathy hesitated. She knew that tone. The Duke was hunting for information with the precision of a man who no longer allowed himself to be caught off guard. "She seems different from what we expected, Your Grace." Each word was chosen as though she were stepping on thin ice. "Stronger, less pliable." "How so?" "When I welcomed her, she interrupted my instructions. She wasn't rude, but she was direct. She does not seem accustomed to asking permission to speak. The maids helped her change for dinner. She tried to refuse most of the assistants, very unusual. In the end, she allowed only what was necessary, and even then she appeared uncomfortable with every touch." Rowan finally turned, his attention sharpening. "Go on." "There were marks on her hands, Your Grace, calluses, not from embroidery or piano." The housekeeper frowned. "Calluses from rains, from labor, from life outdoors. Calluses. For a young woman meant to be delicate, raised for alliances and diplomacy, that was nearly an alarm bell." "She also refused to come down for dinner," Mrs. Abernathy added. "Asked that her meal be brought to her rooms. The maids said she did not sleep, They heard her pacing, and as if she were repeating lines. Practicing. The word struck Rowan's chest like a blade. Practicing. Someone who practices is trying to remember a role. Someone who needs to remember is not being true. He dismissed the housekeeper with a brief gesture and turned back to the window. Snow now blanketed the courtyard like a shroud. Tomorrow at noon he would marry that woman, not out of desire but duty, and because his honor, after what his brother had done, was the only thing he still managed to keep intact. But he would not be naive. He would not trust blindly. He would not ignore the signs. If Lady Grace McLaren was hiding something, he would uncover it. Rowan replayed what he had seen in the library, the way she squeezed something inside her dress pocket, as if relying on it to breathe. The way her accent thickened when she grew irritated. Long vowels, clipped consonants, pure Highland. The way she did not retreat from his measured words, the fire in her eyes. A fire that looked more like battle than etiquette. He climbed the stairs toward his chambers. The corridor of the east wing, where the bride slept, was quiet, save for a sliver of light slipping from beneath her door. She was still awake, still practicing perhaps, still building the mask she would wear as the Duchess of Clydesmore. Rowan stopped, lifted his hand poised to knock. His fist hovered for a second, then slowly he lowered it. Tomorrow would be soon enough. Once she was his wife, he would have all the time he needed to discover what she hid and why. And if the McLarens were attempting deceit, if there was falsehood behind this rushed alliance, someone would pay for it. He had learned from his brother's death that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. But as he turned to leave, an irritating spark flickered at the back of his mind. The green eyes, the defiant tone, the unexpected strength. The woman who had arrived to marry him was anything but meek. And Rowan Sinclair, who had sworn never again to let fascination, desire, or curiosity unsettle him after the chaos love had brought to his family, felt something shift, small, unwanted, dangerous. A spark. And he knew from painful experience that it was always the sparks that burned houses to the ground. Chapter 3. Vows of Falsehood. Isla woke to the muffled sound of footsteps in the corridor, and to the crushing weight of consciousness. Today she would wed a man who did not know her. Today she would become a duchess under a name that was not hers. Today the lie would be sealed before God, written into law, locked away forever, or at least until the truth rose like an inevitable storm to tear everything apart. Pale morning light streamed through the tall windows, making dust specks dance in the cold air. Isla rose from the bed where she had barely slept. The thin wool brushed her skin as she stood, her bare feet meeting the thick carpet that smothered sound, thought, guilt. The room looked like a mausoleum of velvet and dark wood. Curtains of deep wine red, heavy oak furniture, oil portraits of stern-looking women who seemed to judge her in silence. None of it belonged to her. Nothing there did. A soft knock broke the stillness. "Pardon, milady," came a voice from the other side. She answered, and 3 maids stepped inside, carrying the wedding dress with reverent care. The gown seemed to float in their arms. Ivory silk, long sleeves, high collar, elegant but austere. There were no pearls, no sparkle, no joy. It was a dress made for a contract, for mourning, for an alliance that had to exist, even if no one wished to celebrate it. "Your preparations for the ceremony, milady," said the eldest maid, bowing her head. Grace. They did not speak the name, but Isla felt it in the air, a silent knife. Grace should have been there. Grace, who smiled softly. Grace, who played the piano as if defying the world's frailty. Grace, who now lay buried in the Highlands, while Isla walked through her life like a distorted shadow. The maids began their work. The corset was tightened with precise, practiced hands. 2 held the skirt, while the 3rd arranged Isla's hair exactly as Grace had worn it. Every touch felt like an accusation. Every mirror reflected Grace's face. Identical, yes, but Isla could see the difference in the eyes. Grace's gaze was gentle. Isla's was fire, even when she tried to hide the blaze inside her. "You are ready, milady," the maid announced, stepping back. "His Grace awaits." A shiver rippled through Isla. His grace sounded more like a sentence than a title. Before leaving, she touched the tartan ribbon hidden beneath the silk, the only piece of herself she dared bring, a secret against her skin, a keepsake of her dead sister. The walk to the chapel was short, yet somehow endless. Clydesmore was built of twisting corridors like veins of stone, shadows that felt watchful, closed doors that seemed to guard secrets. Mrs. Abernathy escorted her, rigid and silent, and though her expression revealed nothing, Isla had the unsettling impression that the housekeeper saw more than she let on. The chapel was small and stark, its stained glass colors scattering dim light across the cold floor. No flowers, no music, no guests. The castle was still officially in mourning for the Duke's brother, and at the same time the alliance needed to be secured before rivals tried to break it. That was the explanation. That was how they disguised the desperation. The priest waited, clutching the prayer book with trembling hands, and Rowan Sinclair stood beside him. Dressed in black, impeccable and impenetrable, he looked more prepared for a funeral than a wedding. His dark eyes met hers, and Isla felt a terrible, absurd certainty that he could see straight through the silk layers to the machine of lies beating beneath her skin. She walked to the altar. She felt nothing in her feet, nothing in her body, only the pressure of fate tightening around her shoulders like invisible hands. The ceremony began. Latin words echoed through the empty chapel like forgotten prayers. Isla spoke her vows with a voice disturbingly steady, each phrase cutting into her like a blade. Rowan recited his in the same controlled tone of a man completing an obligation, not making a promise of affection. When the moment came for the ring, Rowan took her hand. The touch ran through her like hot metal. Isla steadied her breath, resisting the instinct to pull away. He slid the ring onto her finger, and when their eyes met, something flickered, barely there, in his expression. A hesitation? A recognition? A warning? "I now declare you husband and wife," the priest announced. The words dropped like stone. There was no kiss. Rowan merely inclined his head in a courteous, cold acknowledgement and stepped back. The ceremony was done, the lie officially blessed. They returned to the castle in silence. The dining hall had been set with a simple meal, fitting for haste and mourning. Rowan sat at the head of the table. Isla sat to his left, feeling the distance between them like an abyss. It was Rowan who broke the silence. "You are very quiet," he said, his voice free of any readable emotion. "Not the behavior I expected from you." Isla lifted her eyes. "And what did you expect, Your Grace? Yesterday you seemed ready to confront the world. Today you are as silent as a closed room." He studied her over the rim of his wine-glass. "Contrasts draw attention, milady." Her heart thudded. He was assessing her, measuring her, testing her. "Perhaps," she said, choosing each word with care, "I realize that fighting what is already decided is useless." Rowan tilted his head, watching her with unsettling precision. "Curious to hear someone who does not believe in fate speak of it," he murmured, "and even more curious that I hear it from the lips of Isla." The world stopped. She blinked. "Pardon?" Her voice trembled despite her effort. Rowan set his glass down with calculated grace and rose. He walked around the table slowly, like a man approaching an unavoidable truth. He stopped before her, maintaining proper distance, but his gaze erased all illusion of safety. "Isla," he repeated softly, "not Grace." Air vanished from her lungs. I do not know what your Grace means. Do not lie." His tone wasn't loud, it was worse, perfectly controlled. "There is enough falsehood in this house already." She bit the inside of her cheek. The tartan ribbon felt like it burned under her gown. "Since yesterday, I have noticed details that do not belong to the bride described in my reports," Rowan continued, never looking away. "The calluses on your hands, the accent that slips when you are irritated, the firmness where there should be gentleness, and the way you hesitated when addressed as Milady. I know Grace had a sister, and I know Grace would not have hesitated." Silence crushed Isla on all sides. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. It was not a threat. It was a demand. It was clinical, almost scientific, like a man dismantling a machine to understand its pieces. "Tell me the truth. Now." She closed her eyes. Grace dead. The clan depending on her. Her father pleading. The lie expanding until it no longer fit inside her. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "I am Isla." Her hands trembled. "Grace's sister," she whispered. "Her twin." Rowan didn't move, but something in him fractured. Isla saw it. Not pure anger, but a wound reopening, deep, intimate, painfully familiar, like the hurt of a man who had been betrayed too many times. "The twin," he repeated, the words sounding like steel splintering. "And where is Grace?" Tears rose like a tide. "Dead." The word barely came out. 5 days before the wedding. The fever took her, and my father, he sent me in her place. The alliance had to be honored. He said it was this, or our clan would fall. Rowan stepped back, as though the truth had struck him physically. His breath faltered. For one brief moment, the aristocratic mask slipped, revealed pain, shock, fury, before snapping back into place with ruthless discipline. "I married an imposture," he said, not loudly, but with cutting precision. "A name that no longer exists. I never wanted—" Isla tried to step forward, but he lifted a hand. "Enough." His voice was cold, perfect. "If you had wanted truth, you would have spoken it before I swore before God. Now, there is no excuse I will accept." His hands trembled almost imperceptibly, not from rage, but from memory, from his brother, from another lie, another loss. "Your Grace," Isla whispered. "Leave my presence," he said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The quietness made it far more terrible. Isla rose on unsteady legs and nearly stumbled out, her vision blurred as tears finally broke free. She climbed the stairs, each step echoing like a funeral bell. She closed herself inside her chambers, hers by marriage, hers by shame, and collapsed onto the cold stone floor. The wedding dress spread around her like crushed wings, and Isla McLaren, or what remained of her, wept. She wept for Grace, for the clan, for herself, and for the man whose trust she had shattered before she ever had the chance to know him. She knew he would not forgive her, and that night, for the first time since she agreed to the deception, Isla understood. Perhaps he was right. Chapter 4. A Wounded Truth. Rowan Sinclair remained alone in the great hall for an undefined span of time, minutes, perhaps hours. Anger burned through him like live embers, but beneath it pulsed something older, deeper and far more familiar. That recognized ache, that wound that throbbed every time he was reminded that trusting someone was a dangerous luxury. The ache that had begun in the barn years ago before his brother's lifeless body. He walked to the fireplace and braced both hands against the cold stone mantel. The weak heat from the flames did nothing to thaw his chest. Isla. Not Grace. Isla. The twin. The replacement sent to him as though he were too blind to notice the difference, as though his life could be shaped and bartered by others without consequence. And he had married her, spoken the vows, slipped the ring onto her finger. Before God and the law, Isla McLaren, the woman delivered to him through a lie born in the Highlands, was his wife. The shock of the discovery reverberated through him. Rowan set his fist upon the stone, not with violence but with enough force to feel the impact rise through his arm. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything. He merely stood there, breathing deeply as his mind organized the facts, like a general preparing for battle. He could annul the marriage, in theory, claim fraud, but the annulment of a ducal wedding would be a scandal of the worst kind. And worse, it would reignite disputes between Clydesmore and the McLarens, disputes that decades of negotiations had tried to bury. The honor of both houses would collapse, the contested lands would return to war, and the duchy would be seen as weak, led by a man incapable of discernment. Rowan Sinclair would never allow that. A soft sound pulled him from his thoughts. 3 discreet knocks. "Enter," he said without turning. The door opened. And Mrs. Abernathy stepped in with the composure of someone who had served the Sinclair family for nearly 30 years. She paused a few steps behind him, keeping the appropriate distance. "Your Grace," she murmured cautiously. The servants heard raised voices. Rowan drew in a measured breath. "She is not Grace," he said, his voice low but steady. "She is the sister, Isla. Grace is dead, and the McLarens sent her twin in her place." A tense silence stretched between them. At last, Mrs. Abernathy spoke. "I suspected it, but I was not certain." Rowan turned slowly. "And why did you not tell me?" The housekeeper straightened her shoulders as though defending her own honor. "Because I sensed more fear than deception in her manner, Your Grace, and I did not think it right to accuse a frightened young woman without proof. She seemed lost." Lost. The word echoed through Rowan's mind. He remembered the slight tremor in her hands as she repeated her vows, the way she clutched something hidden in her gown, the hesitation when addressed as Milady, the tears that did not look theatrical, but inevitable. Rowan faced the fire again. "Leave her in her chambers," he said. His voice sounded harsher than he intended. "I do not wish to see her tonight." Mrs. Abernathy bowed respectfully and withdrew. As soon as the door closed, the hall felt too small. He needed air. Rowan crossed the empty corridors of the castle and stepped out the back where fresh snow blanketed the gardens. The cold struck his face like a clean blade, a relief, if only for a moment. Evening had fallen, painting everything in deep blue. He walked without direction, led not by purpose but by the need to move away from himself. His steps carried him to the family cemetery, where bare trees stood like silent sentinels. The graves, glazed with frost, reflected the crescent moon. He stopped before the newest stone, Malcolm Sinclair, the brother who should have been Duke, the brother who laughed easily, the brother who chose love when he should have chosen life, and lost both. Rowan knelt, the icy ground biting through his trousers like memory. "You believed in love," he whispered, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. "And look where it led you." But as he said it, Rowan knew part of the accusation was a lie. Malcolm had not died because he loved too much. He died because expectation crushed him, because disapproval suffocated him, because duty consumed him, because no one reached him in time to save him. The same pressure now weighed on Isla, and cruelly, on Rowan himself. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he noticed the snow falling heavier. The moon, now higher, cast a pale glow over the castle in the distance. One window was still lit in the east wing. Her chambers. Isla. The imposter. The wife. He should hate her. And part of him did, not for who she was, but for what she represented. Proof that even vigilant, he had still been deceived. But another part, small, persistent, infuriating, could not ignore something deeper. The way she spoke the truth, the way her voice broke, the way she didn't try to bargain, manipulate, or plead, as though confession had cost her something irreplaceable. Rowan returned to the castle with slow, contemplative steps. When he reached the east wing, he paused before her door. No sound came from inside, no sobbing, no movement. He raised his hand, hesitated. What would he say if he entered? That he forgave her? A lie. That he hated her? Also a lie. That he understood? A weakness he would never admit aloud. His hand dropped. Not yet. He turned and walked down the silent corridor, as he had done on so many nights since Malcolm's death, a duke trying to resemble stone, while inside he felt the old fracture splitting across his chest once more. And as he walked away, he could not shake her image, green eyes shining through tear, haunting him like a shadow. Not forgiveness, not yet. But somewhere beneath all the anger, something had begun, something he refused to name. Not tonight. Not while the night remained so cold, and so full of truths he was not ready to face. Chapter 5. Fragments of Truth. Isla did not leave her chambers for 3 days, not because she was locked in, the door had no key, but because shame was a harsher prison than any bolt of iron. She spent the hours seated near the window, watching the snow-covered gardens, always the same, always silent. The castle breathed around her like some ancient creature, indifferent to human pain, and Isla folded in on herself beneath the weight of her grief. Meals arrived on trays, left discreetly inside the door. The maids avoided meeting her eyes, not out of contempt but discomfort. Isla thanked them in a whisper, and they vanished as quickly as they came. She ate little, slept less. She had no idea what Rowan would decide to do with her: exile her, hide her, tolerate her as a convenient lie. On the third day, 3 soft knocks broke the stillness. "Come in," Isla said, her voice weaker than she intended. Mrs. Abernathy entered, carrying a stack of folded clothes in her arms. She offered a small curtsy. "Your Grace, the Duke requests your presence in his study at 3 o'clock. Requests. He was not asking, not inviting, he was summoning. Isla nodded, her stomach twisting. The housekeeper laid the dresses on the bed. Dark blue wool, sober cuts, elegant, appropriate for a newly married duchess in mourning. For a moment, Isla simply stared at the fabric, unable to touch it. "Is he very angry?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Abernathy lifted her gaze. Her eyes were not hard, but clear. "He is hurt, milady," she said at last. And hurt men tend to be far less predictable than angry ones. The word hurt opened a crack inside Isla, a pain she hadn't known how to name before. She had expected his anger, but not the wound beneath it. When Mrs. Abernathy left, Isla washed her face, drew a steadying breath, and tried to dress. After 2 failed attempts to fasten her own bodice with shaking hands, she called the maids. She would not manage alone, however much she wished to avoid human touch. The women worked in silence, tightening the laces, pinning her hair into a simple low chignon. There were no adornments, no delicate lace. Nothing about her resembled a bride. Perhaps it was better that way. At exactly 3 o'clock, Isla walked down the corridor toward the Duke's study. Her heart beat too fast, almost painfully. She knocked. "Come in," came his voice, controlled, distant. She stepped inside. The study was smaller than the library, but more alive. Maps lined the walls, papers were spread across the desk. A forgotten teacup cooled beside an ink pot. Rowan stood by the window with his back to her, as if watching the inner courtyard without truly seeing it. "Sit," he said without turning. Isla obeyed. She folded her hands in her lap, forcing them to be still. The silence that followed stretched too long, a taut wire on the verge of snapping. When Rowan finally faced her, she saw the dark circles beneath his eyes, the tension in his jaw. He did not look furious. He looked exhausted. "I have spent the last 3 days evaluating our options," he began, stepping closer to the desk, but not taking his seat. He kept an exact distance, as though measuring uncertain terrain. "There are grounds for annulment. Some would argue I am fully within my rights. But that—" He drew a long breath. "That would reignite old disputes with your clan. It would endanger agreements that took years to secure, and—" He glanced away for a brief moment, as if revealing more than he wished. "It would have severe consequences for you." Isla swallowed. "I did not imagine that would weigh on you," she murmured. "I did not want a marriage built on deceit," he replied, his tone low but steady. "But neither do I wish to become an instrument of ruin or revenge. I have seen enough of both for one lifetime." At last he sat, posture impeccable and yet strained. "Therefore," he said, "the marriage stands, not by choice, but necessity. You will continue as Duchess of Clydesmore. You will have your chambers, I will have mine. We will appear together when the occasion demands it. The rest will remain as it is." Isla nodded slowly. It was more than she deserved, and yet, for reasons she could not entirely explain, it hurt. "Grace would have been better for you," she said, her voice catching. "She had a gentleness I never possessed. She knew what to say. She learned how to be what I never managed to be." Rowan studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "And what do you believe yourself to be?" he asked. His tone was controlled, devoid of derision. "Who is Isla McLaren When you strip away the role that was forced upon her. The question startled her. Isla drew a breath, words fighting to assemble. She hesitated. I was never the daughter my father wanted. I had no patience for embroidery, no talent for the piano. I spoke too much, rode too much, failed too much. I was always a little out of place, and when Grace fell ill, there was nothing I could do. I could only watch, only wait. And when she died, it felt wrong that I kept breathing when she could not. Rowan stayed silent. His silence did not accuse. It listened. Isla realized her hands were trembling. Do not take this as a defense, she whispered. The lie is still a lie, but I did it out of love. Out of desperation too, perhaps. And if I had said no, they would have lost the lands, and my father would have... Her voice broke. He would have blamed me forever. So I came. I did what I thought had to be done. Rowan turned his gaze toward the window, and when he spoke, his voice was softer. I found my brother hanging from the beams in the barn, he said, pausing before forcing the words out. I stood there for hours before I could move. He left a letter behind. Forbidden love, despair, guilt, things no one should ever have to read from their own brother. Isla's heart twisted. I am sorry, she said quietly, honestly. There is no pain like loving someone who chooses to leave. Perhaps, Rowan murmured, eyes lost in the snowy courtyard. Or perhaps greater still is the pain of living with the question of what more could have been done to keep them. I know that question, Isla said, taking a few careful steps closer. But guilt doesn't bring back the dead. It only drags us to where they are. Neither of you deserved that. Rowan did not answer at once. When he finally turned back to her, his eyes were not cold, merely tired, deeply human, wounded in ways Isla understood too well. You are not what I expected, he said, echoing the words from their first meeting. But this time there was no disdain, only quiet surprise. Nor are you, Isla replied, a small, sad smile touching her lips. I thought I would find an executioner. Instead, I found a man carrying a burden heavier than mine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the snow drifted down in slow flakes, as if the world were holding its breath. Rowan lifted his hand, then hesitated. In the end, he did not take her hand. He reached instead to gently wipe away a single tear tracing down her cheek. The gesture was brief, almost formal, and yet Isla felt something shift inside her, silent and deep. Do not mistake this for forgiveness, Rowan said quietly, his voice soft but steady. The wound is still open. I am not asking for forgiveness, Isla replied, only time. A chance to show you who I am. Without the mask. He studied her a moment longer, then inclined his head once. Perhaps, he murmured, we shall see what time does. Isla drew a long breath. While this bond lasts, Your Grace, she said, I promise I will not add any new lies to it. One corner of Rowan's mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but something close, a hint of light in a very long night. Then let us begin again, he said, extending his hand with restrained formality. Isla McLaren, Duchess of Clydesmore. She placed her hand in his. Isla, she answered. Just Isla. And so, in that quiet study, surrounded by snow and secrets, two strangers bound by duty and loss took the first step, small, fragile, perhaps dangerous, toward something neither of them dared to name. Not peace, not love, but the first hairline crack in the wall between them. Chapter 6. Between Walls and Bridges. In the nights that followed their conversation in the study, Rowan Sinclair slept little. He would lie down, blow out the candles, close his eyes, and yet the stillness of his chamber offered no rest. Instead, memory rose in waves. Isla's voice as she spoke of Grace, steady and fractured all at once. The way her gaze had held his when she confessed the truth, the quiet lucidity with which she understood the pain of loss without diminishing it or turning it into theater. He had said he needed time, and it was true. But time, he discovered, had no interest in keeping things untouched. Several days passed, then an entire week, in which they hardly saw one another, not by accident but by caution. Rowan kept to his routine with military discipline, inspecting the estate, meeting with the steward, answering letters from lawyers and representatives. He knew Isla kept to her own hours. Servants whispered she preferred the gardens, even in the cold, and requested books instead of embroidery. He pretended not to hear these remarks, but he remembered everyone. Sometimes he caught sight of her from afar, crossing a corridor with Mrs. Abernathy, standing at a window, face turned toward the snow, kneeling in the inner courtyard, touching a bare branch as if testing winter's resolve. On such occasions, Rowan offered a brief nod, a formal, "Your Grace," too stiff for husband and wife, and walked on. Keeping her at the edges of his thoughts should have been safe. But safety seldom lasted long in Clydesmore. A little over 2 weeks after the wedding, on a grey morning, Rowan walked through the east wing when raised voices drifted from a half-open door. "I said it isn't necessary," Isla's irritated voice rang clearly. "I can dress myself." "My lady," Mrs. Abernathy replied, patient but slipping toward exasperation, "no one doubts your ability, but a duchess does not fasten her own corset. The maids must attend to these things. That is how it is done. Back home I dressed myself, saddled my own horses, and on some days stirred the great pots in the kitchen," Isla snapped. "I refused to become helpless simply because someone handed me a title." Rowan paused, considering whether to enter. Then he knocked. Silence fell immediately. "Come in," came her tense reply. He stepped inside. Isla stood with her back to him, wearing only her linen chemise and underskirt. Her hair fell loose in long waves nearly to her waist, catching the pale morning light. A maid tightened the corset ribbons, while another held the dark green gown ready. Mrs. Abernathy looked like a weary general dealing with an unruly recruit. The three women curtsied at his arrival. Isla wrapped a shawl over her shoulders with as much dignity as she could manage, cheeks warming with colour. Rowan politely averted his gaze, fixing it on her face rather than anywhere else. Still, the brief glimpse had seared itself into his memory far more than he wished to admit. "Your Grace," Mrs. Abernathy said quickly, "we were only—" "I understand," Rowan cut in, courteous. "I won't intrude. I simply need a few minutes with my wife when she is ready." "Yes, Your Grace." He stepped into the corridor and waited, hearing the rustle of skirts and muffled voices. After a few minutes the door opened, and Isla emerged, composed once more. Green gown, fastened hair in a simple low bun, carrying the air of someone who did not belong here, but was trying. "Your Grace," she greeted with a small bow. Rowan gestured for her to follow. They walked side by side to a smaller sitting room, its tall windows overlooking the inner courtyard. He closed the door behind them. "I heard the disagreement," he said, direct but not unkind. "About the maids." Isla folded her arms, a defensive stance she probably didn't realize she used. "If disagreement means two people holding different arguments, then yes," she replied. "I don't see why so many people are needed to dress one woman." "It is not about necessity," Rowan said. "It is about custom, appearance. Servants observe everything, and when what they observe differs too greatly from what they expect, rumors begin." Her lips pressed together. "There is already one lie too many here," she murmured. "I don't see why I should worry about appearing proper when I'm not even the woman meant to be in this place." A brief silence. Rowan watched her closely. "Exactly because there is already one great lie," he said at last. "We cannot afford additional suspicions. Your upbringing, your temperament, your differences from what was expected of Grace, all of this must be handled with care." Her green eyes lifted, restless, wounded. "So protecting me is a matter of convenience." He considered the answer longer than he intended. "In the beginning, yes," he said honestly, "convenience, alliance, peace. But—" a pause. "It would be a lie to say that is all it is now." A soft surprise brightened her expression. "And what else is it then?" Rowan turned briefly toward the window, snow whitening the courtyard below. "Let us say I dislike the idea of watching you stumble through a world you do not know, judged by rules no one bothered to explain to you." When he looked at her again, she was studying him as though trying to detect the truth between his words. "What do you suggest?" she asked quietly. He inhaled. "That we talk," he said, a word that felt unfamiliar in his mouth, not only about what lies behind us, but what awaits ahead. About duties, expectations, what it means to be seen as a duke and duchess. I can teach you what I know. The rest, we will adjust along the way. She frowned slightly. I've read many stories about dukes and duchesses. None of them had a chapter titled Lessons to Survive Marriage. Against his will, Rowan felt the corner of his mouth threaten a smile. "Clydesmore rarely follows a script," he replied. "I see no reason to begin now." She exhaled, tension loosening a fraction. "And when would these lessons begin?" "Tonight," he said. "The small salon will be prepared for a simple dinner, just the two of us. No unnecessary attendance, only the essential staff to serve. Would that be acceptable?" For an instant, she seemed ready to refuse, then slowly she nodded. "I accept. The following days formed a strange new rhythm. In the mornings, Isla was sometimes spotted in the library, paging through etiquette, geography, and history books that Mrs. Abernathy had selected at Rowan's request. Other times she walked the lower garden, cloak pulled tightly around her, a maid shadowing her from a distance, enough to avoid scandal, far enough to give her air. In the afternoons, Rowan saw her only in passing, a brief greeting, a few polite words. But on some evenings the small salon was prepared again, a table for two, softer lighting, modest dishes, restrained wine. Their first dinner was nearly silent. Rowan spoke of the estate, harvests, accounts, leases, the topics he commanded easily. Isla listened, sometimes questioning, often only nodding, her fingers brushing the rim of her glass. She remained tense, as though waiting to be judged at every slip. The second evening, she spoke of the highlands, a valley between mountains, horses sinking into shallow snow, a river that only half froze in winter, as if refusing to surrender entirely to the cold. On the third, he mentioned a book he had read in his youth about an explorer lost in the North Sea. Isla admitted she had always preferred stories of battles or tragic heroes, because at least their people knew what they were fighting for. "And we do not?" Rowan asked, unaware the question had slipped out. She held his gaze. "Perhaps we do," she said softly. "We just never had a choice in the battle." One of those nights, perhaps the third or fourth, the atmosphere shifted. Rowan noticed her shoulders had eased, as if some of the weight she carried had finally relented. She even laughed at something he said, a brief startled laugh, as if she could not recall the last time she had laughed without apologizing afterward. "I never imagined the Duke of Clydesmore capable of irony," she teased. "And I never imagined you capable of admitting a duke has any human traits at all," he replied. She flushed, but didn't retreat. "I misjudged you," she admitted. "I expected a man too cold to feel. I found someone who feels more than he would like." Rowan set down his cutlery. "And I expected a girl so docile she barely had opinions. Instead, I found someone who argues with the housekeeper about corsets." A spark of amusement lit her eyes. "Is that meant to be a compliment?" "I haven't decided yet," he said, though his tone betrayed the truth. They looked at one another then, not as adversaries tied by a forced alliance, but as two people trying to see what lay beyond the walls each had built. When dinner ended, Rowan accompanied her to her chamber door. It was unusual. They could have parted in the main corridor, but he did it anyway, offering no explanation even to himself. They paused at the threshold. Isla held her skirt with one hand, unsure what to do with the other. "Thank you for dinner, Your Grace," she said. "It was less uncomfortable than I expected." He inclined his head. "I'm unsure whether that is a compliment." "It's the closest I can manage tonight," she said with a faint, shy smile. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was full, dense with unsaid things. Rowan felt a strange pull then, the kind he had once dismissed easily. Now, however, ignoring it felt harder. He raised his hand. He could have simply bowed, as he would to any lady of rank, but instead he took her fingers gently and brushed them with his lips in a brief formal gesture. Even so, his heart beat faster than reason allowed. "Good night, Your Grace," he murmured. "Good night, Rowan," she answered. His name, spoken softly, settled on him with a curious weight, not as a title, but as a man. He stepped away before the fragile line between caution and danger broke. Walking back to his own chambers, he paused by a window overlooking the courtyard. Snow kept falling, layering the world in white. From afar it seemed to erase everything. Up close, though, Rowan knew snow never erased. It only covered. Everything remained beneath, waiting for the thaw. He thought of Ela. Of the woman who should not have been there yet was. Of the lie that had bound them, and the quiet truths revealing themselves between dinners, between guarded words and glances that lingered a breath too long. It was not love, of course not. But neither was it anger, duty, or convenience anymore. It was the beginning of something he did not dare name, something that, if he wasn't careful, might turn walls into bridges, and bridges into roads from which no man returned unscathed. And Rowan Sinclair, remembering his brother and everything love had destroyed, felt an old fear awaken. Fear not of Isla, but of himself, and of what might happen if he allowed this fragile closeness to continue. Even so, that night, he did not cancel their dinners, nor did he order distance. For the first time since the wedding was sealed, he chose not to retreat. And that small choice might have been the first real stone laid in the bridge rising, slowly, dangerously, between him and the woman who bore a name that was not hers, but a heart that, regretfully, had begun to matter. Chapter 7. The Risk of the Heart. Isla awoke with the strange sensation that the air in Clydesmore had changed, or perhaps it was only her. Rowan's simple gesture the night before, the way he had lifted her hand to his lips, had given her something she had not expected to feel so soon. Warmth. Not hope. Hope was far too dangerous, but something close to it. A softening. A quiet relief that settled in her chest like an ember sheltered from the wind. She shouldn't feel that. And yet she did. While she dressed, refusing the exaggerated fussing of two maids insisting on tightening her corset beyond reason, Isla felt her heart tugging in a way that mingled fear and longing. Not only longing of the body, but of closeness, of something she had only ever shared with Grace. She was still inside that uneasy softness when Mrs. Abernathy knocked. "My lady, a letter has arrived." Isla recognized the handwriting before she even broke the seal. Her mother. But the contents brought no comfort. "Your marriage has been confirmed. We expect you to fulfill your duty as wife and future mother of heirs. Do not shame Grace by failing where she would have succeeded." Each word fell like stone. Heirs. Isla could scarcely breathe as she folded the letter. Heirs of a marriage that was, in truth, a quiet treaty. Cold, fragile, half-formed. Heirs with a man she barely knew, though each day she found herself wanting to. Duty, always duty. She spent the morning in the library seeking refuge in poetry. The weak March sun filtered through the windows, melting the snow little by little, as if winter were finally tired. It was there Rowan found her. He entered without a sound, yet she sensed him before he spoke. The echo of the kiss on her hand, that almost intimacy. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, approaching with his usual controlled stride. "The library has become your harbor, so I hear." Isla tried to smile, but the letter sat like lead beneath her ribs. He noticed. Rowan always noticed. "Bad news?" he asked, voice low, careful. She hesitated, then handed him the folded letter. He read it in silence. When he finished, his eyes had darkened. "Your clan presses for something neither of us agreed to," he said. "They expect this marriage to be consummated." Isla felt heat rush violently to her cheeks. "They expect me to fulfill my role, for you to... Shame strangled the rest of the sentence. Rowan ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture, revealing true discomfort. "Isla, you should not bear that expectation. Not now. Not before." He paused, as though the words themselves resisted. "Not before there is honesty between us." She lifted her eyes. "And is there any?" It took him a moment to answer. When he did, his voice was gentler than she had ever heard it. "There is the beginning." Silence filled the room, not empty but full. "When I began to know you these past weeks," he continued, "when I saw you struggle to fit into a world never meant for you, I realized something I had not foreseen." He drew a slow breath. "That perhaps out of all the women who might have entered this castle, the only one capable of challenging it, of challenging me, is you." Her heart stuttered. Rowan looked away, as if searching for courage. "I tried to keep distance," he admitted, "out of duty, out of fear. I fear repeating Malcolm's mistakes. I fear losing control of my own life. But being near you has begun to erode those defenses, slowly. And I do not know what to do with that." Isla stood, approaching him one measured step at a time. "Rowan." He raised a hand and touched her cheek with the barest brush of his fingers, hesitant, almost reverent. "I should not," he murmured. "Then stop," she whispered. "If you want to stop, stop." But he didn't. His hand remained there, warm, steady, grounding her. For the first time, Isla felt without doubt that he did not see her as an intruder nor a mistake, but as a woman. "If we take any step beyond this," Rowan said softly, almost a sigh, "there will be no easy return, and perhaps we shouldn't. Not yet." He let his hand fall. The loss of his touch hit her with the cold of winter returning. "I understand," she said gently. "And I'm not asking for haste, only for truth, even if it is small or slow." He smiled, a real smile, the first she had ever seen. "Slow truth is all I can offer." They stood side by side, watching the snow melt. There was no kiss, no vow. But there was something nearly as powerful. The first time Rowan did not step back. The first time Isla realized his heart, despite its walls, beat faster when she was near. A small bridge between them. Hours later, long after night had settled, Rowan knocked at the library door while she read. "Isla," he said, face unreadable. "Tomorrow. I'd like us to dine again, in the small salon. No formalities, no expectations. Just to continue where we left off." She nodded. "I would like that very much." When he walked away, Isla pressed a hand to her chest, as if trying to steady her own heart. It was happening slowly, but it was happening. And perhaps, slowly, was exactly what they both needed. Chapter 8. Settling the Score. Rowan Sinclair had never been a man of impulses. Since Malcolm's death, he had learned to weigh every gesture, every word, as though the stability of the world depended on his ability to keep order. For years it had been enough. Control was his armor, distance his shield. But in the weeks that followed that morning in the library, when he had admitted to Isla, however carefully, that his defenses were no longer intact, something in him began to give way. Not all at once, not with a crash, but like melting snow, first in droplets, nearly invisible, then in thin, insistent streams, carving paths where once there had only been ice. The dinners in the small salon continued. Sometimes their conversation stayed on neutral ground. The health of elder servants, the state of the roads around Clydesmore, letters from London discussing laws unlikely to touch the Highlands in any immediate way. Other nights, though, the conversation drifted into places Rowan had never imagined sharing with anyone. One evening, Isla spoke of Grace, not as a perfect martyr, nor as a cruel comparison, but as a real sister, one who laughed too loudly, who cried over small things, who sometimes envied her and sometimes defended her with a ferocity that frightened people. She was terrified of thunderstorms, Isla said, wineglass forgotten in her hand. She used to hide in the wardrobe of my room because she said the smell of my clothes calmed her. Rowan listened in silence, with a rare attentiveness. "And you?" he asked at last. "What are you afraid of?" She thought for a moment. "Of becoming someone I don't recognize," she answered. "Of looking in the mirror one day and not knowing if the face I see is mine, or just the mask everyone expected me to wear." That night, when he walked her to her door, Rowan did not touch her. But he stood there looking at the closed wood for a long time, as if he might still see through it. On another night it was his turn to speak. Not about Malcolm directly, that wound was still too raw, but about the smaller things, how he had grown to appreciate the castle's silence after political battles in Edinburgh, how he always felt more at ease among books and maps than in crowded ballrooms. "I was never the sort of man who fills a room," he said with a faint smile. "Malcolm, yes. All he had to do was walk in and everyone turned. I was always the one standing at the door watching." "I'd tell you you're wrong," Isla replied, "but I know you'd hate that." He lifted one eyebrow. "Hate it?" "Yes." There was a glint of amusement in her eyes. "You'd rather go on believing no one notices you, when in truth—" She stopped. "When, in truth?" He pressed, curious. Isla looked away. "When, in truth, it's rather difficult to ignore you," she admitted. "Even when you try to be nothing more than a shadow in the corner." Rowan didn't comment, but that night it took him far longer than usual to fall asleep. It was nearly a month after that first conversation about slow truth in the library that everything changed in a decisive way. That morning, Isla received another letter from the Highlands. Her mother's hand. She read it only once, and this time she did not let Rowan see. But the effect was plain. She spent the rest of the day quieter, tenser, as though something inside her had been cinched too tight. Rowan found her that afternoon in the lower garden, standing beside the small rosebush he had ordered, planted weeks earlier when the snow first began to retreat. It was still a thin, fragile thing, just new leaves and no buds yet, but Isla was watching it as if it were a promise. "Another letter?" he asked, approaching. She did not pretend otherwise. "Yes." He waited. "My mother says the clan is asking," Isla murmured at last, eyes fixed on the bare branches, "whether the marriage is being lived as it should." Colour flooded her cheeks. "Whether there will be an heir." Rowan felt his jaw tighten. "To them, you are nothing but a means to an end," he said, without softening the truth. "A womb securing land and names." "And to you, am I any different?" she asked, not accusing, just painfully honest. He drew in a deep breath. "I won't deny that when the agreement was struck I thought in terms of convenience," he said, "protecting borders, cooling old conflicts, an heir that would bind Sinclair and MacLaren blood." He paused. "But that was before I knew you." A cold breeze tugged at a loose strand of Isla's hair. "And now?" she whispered. Rowan stepped closer, narrowing the space between them. It unsettled him to see how her hands were trembling. "Now," he said slowly, as though weighing every syllable, "the thought of an heir comes later, as a possible consequence of something I am still learning to accept." His dark gaze met hers, steady, serious. "First, I need to learn not to be afraid of wanting someone to stay." Isla's green eyes shone. "And do you?" The question was barely sound. Rowan did not answer with words. Driven by an impulse he would have called reckless at any other time, he raised his hand and touched her face, not lightly, as he had before, but with the firm assurance of someone who was finally choosing the gesture. His thumb swept along her cheekbone, feeling the warmth of her skin against the chill of the morning. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, as though that touch hurt and healed at once. "Isla," he said quietly, "there are things I cannot promise. I cannot promise I will never fail, never fear, never pull back. But I know that—" he swallowed. "I know I do not wish to go on through this life with any other woman at my side, nor with the ghost of the one who was supposed to be here. I want you." She opened her eyes, and there was no doubt in them, only shock and something raw and bright. "I don't know if I deserve that," she murmured. "But I want it. More than I have the courage to admit." He leaned closer, slowly enough to give her time to retreat if she wished. She didn't. She didn't move at all. She simply stood there, breathing the same air. When his lips finally touched hers, the kiss was soft, almost a question. Isla answered by leaning in just a little, turning it into an answer. It remained gentle, controlled, free of reckless urgency, yet it held everything they had avoided saying for weeks: fear, desire, gratitude. A wordless promise: I will at least try. When they drew apart, nothing visible had changed. The gardens were still there, the rosebush still bare, the letter from her mother still existed in her dress pocket. But inside, a line had been crossed. That night, Rowan sat at the desk in his chamber, a single candle burning low over maps and documents he couldn't read. Instead of figures and names, he saw only Isla's eyes. He could still taste that quiet, unsettling kiss. Could he simply go on as things were? Could he go on in a marriage that in the eyes of the world was lawful, but in his own conscience was built atop an unresolved lie? The answer came with a clarity he had in truth been avoiding. No, he could not. If he was going to ask himself to trust again, if he was going to ask Isla to risk her heart after all her fear and guilt, then he could not keep her bound to a lie that had never been hers, one crafted by her father, her clan, born of desperate decisions. He would have to settle the score, not only with the McLarens, but with himself. He pulled out paper, pen, and ink. It took time to find the words. He did not want open threats. That would be small, unworthy of the woman who now shared his house and slowly his life. But he would not write some timid request either. He was a duke. He had been wronged, and above all, he was now Isla's husband because he chose to be, not because someone cornered him. He wrote, Lord McLaren, matters of the utmost importance concerning the marriage solemnized between myself and your daughter require your presence at Clydesmore, accompanied by Lady McLaren, at your earliest possible convenience. This is not an invitation but a summons that irregularities may be addressed with the discretion and dignity both our houses deserve. The honor of your name and mine demands no less. Rowan Sinclair, Duke of Clydesmore. He sealed the letter with his signet ring, the crest pressed into red wax like a final stroke. He waited for dawn, then called for a messenger. You will place this in Lord McLaren's hands. No one else's, he said, and you do not return without an answer. When the door closed behind the servant, Rowan remained alone in the study, the candle burning down to a stub. Oddly, he felt lighter. The fear was still there, fear of disturbing what was settled in the eyes of society, fear of Lord McLaren's reaction, fear of the consequences if everything came to light. But for the first time in many years, fear was not the only weight on the scales. There was something else, new, unwelcome, dangerous, a desire to build something clean in his own name, with the woman who now occupied not only the cold corridors of Clydesmore, but the empty spaces he had once believed would remain that way forever. Later that day he found Isla in the library. She stood before the window, a book open in her hands, her eyes fixed on the world outside. When he entered, she turned, and he saw the reflection of the kiss in the way she looked at him. There was no evasion now, only awareness. I've sent a letter, Rowan said without preamble. To whom? The question came, but her body already seemed to know the answer. To your father. Color drained from her face. Rowan. He approached her slowly as he had in the garden. I will not expose you, he said. I will not give the newspapers a scandal nor turn your family into a spectacle. But I will not let our beginning, twisted as it was, remain uncorrected. He paused. They need to know that I do not consider you a replacement, that I do not keep you here merely because I was deceived. They need to hear, from me, that I choose you, with full knowledge. With your true name. Isla's eyes filled with tears, not only from fear but something deeper. And if he refuses, she whispered, if he says he does not approve, if he tries to take me back. Rowan took her hands in his, as he had in the garden, but with a steadier resolve. Listen to me, Isla McLaren, he said, one of the few times he had spoken her name with that kind of gravity. There is no force in all of Scotland that will remove you from here against your will. If your father comes ready for a fight, I will fight. If he comes to bargain, I will bargain. But in any case, he tightened his grip, you are not a coin to be traded. Not anymore. She drew a long, shuddering breath, as though trying to absorb each word. "He will come," Rowan murmured, "and when he does, we will set this story right. All of it." His voice lowered as he added, "So that if one day we choose to embrace everything this marriage can mean, there will be no ghosts hovering between us." Isla's cheeks flushed, but she did not draw back. "So," she said, her voice trembling only slightly, "you want all of this to have a chance to be complete?" "If," Rowan replied with a stark honesty, "you want that too." She held his gaze for a long moment, long enough for his heart to beat in that old, uncomfortable way, waiting. Then Isla nodded. "I do," she said simply, "even though I'm afraid." She drew in another breath. "But if you believe it is worth the risk, then I will believe it too." Rowan felt something old shift inside his chest. "Then we face it together," he said. That same afternoon, a rider arrived with Lord MacLaren's reply. The letter was short, formal, but it said enough. "Your Grace, your summons has been received. My wife and I will make our way to Clydesmore as soon as the weather allows." MacLaren. Rowan folded the paper and placed it in the desk drawer, and only then noticed that his hands were trembling. Not purely from fear, but from anticipation. Isla was in the inner courtyard when he left the study. The early spring wind tugged at her skirts and at the strands of hair that had escaped her pins. He walked to her, and without a word, held out the letter. She read it, then lifted her eyes. "He is coming." "He is coming," Rowan confirmed. For a moment her expression wavered. Fear, guilt, the faint echo of a girl who once trembled at a father's reproach. But beneath it all, something new burned. A small, steady spark of resolve. Isla folded the letter with a calm he hadn't expected. "Then let him come," she said. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the truth to catch us. I want to look forward. With you." For the first time in years, Rowan felt he was not the only one carrying the weight of hard decisions. He stepped closer. "When he arrives," he said quietly, "it's likely things will be said that hurt you. Harsh words, old fears, old guilt. But remember this, Isla. None of it changes what has already begun between us. Nothing." She nodded again. "I know," she replied, and for the first time she smiled even with fear in her eyes. "It's strange. I've spent my life running from confrontations. Now I'm tired of running." Rowan didn't resist. He bent and brushed his lips over hers in a brief, sure kiss, a silent seal on a pact that existed in no document yet, but was already written between them. When he drew back, he thought he heard far off the faint echo of wheels on a distant road. Or perhaps it was only his imagination. Either way, he knew the time of waiting was nearly over. Very soon, Clydesmore would face not only the echo of an old lie, but the reckoning it demanded. And if things went as he meant them to, nothing between him and Isla would stand on deceit anymore. Only on choices. Chapter 9. When Truth Walks Through the Door. The morning the MacLarens arrived at Clydesmore began grey, with mist sinking over the gardens like a heavy veil. Fitting, Rowan thought, watching from the upper window as the carriage wheels sank into the wet mud of the courtyard. Fitting because old truths rarely came in sunlight. Isla stood beside him, not behind, not half hidden, but at his side, just as he had warned she would. She wore no elaborate gown and no jewelry. Her hair was partly pinned back, the rest falling softly, and her dress was a deep blue that made her eyes seem even brighter. She was nervous. He could feel it in the tension of her shoulders, but she faced the moment with her chin raised. When Lord and Lady MacLaren stepped down from the carriage, Isla took a small step forward. Not to hide behind Rowan, but to show she would stand. Rowan felt a surprising spark of pride catch inside his chest. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Isla drew a deep breath. "Yes." And together they descended the stairs. Lady MacLaren reached them first. Her eyes met Isla's and filled with tears at once. "My girl," she whispered, surprising Isla by pulling her into a tight embrace. "My brave girl." Rowan saw Isla return the embrace, but there was stiffness in the way her arms moved. There was pain there, the pain of everything that had been left unsaid. Lord MacLaren approached with heavy steps. He was a man who did not surrender ground without a fight. Rowan could tell that from the firm set of his shoulders, from the way his gaze took in every detail with suspicion. He was a chieftain used to being obeyed, to being feared, and he no doubt believed he had come to Clydesmore to face an angry duke and negotiate damage. He did not expect what Rowan truly intended. "Your Grace," he said rigidly, offering a bow that was shorter than protocol required. Rowan did not return it fully, not as an insult, but as a quiet assertion of his own authority. "Lord MacLaren," he replied, "we have much to discuss. Please follow me to the study." The patriarch's stiffness sharpened further, but he followed, and Isla did too without looking away. The air in the study felt heavier than the mist outside. Rowan remained standing behind his desk, both hands resting firmly on the dark wood. Isla sat in a chair to one side, but her posture was straight, not shrunken. Lady MacLaren took the chair beside her. Lord MacLaren stayed on his feet, as though sitting would mean yielding. Rowan began without ornament. "Let us be direct," he said, his gaze fixed on the MacLaren patriarch. "I married a woman whose identity had been falsified. A young lady who in truth was already dead." Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Lady MacLaren pressed her hands to her face. Isla closed her eyes but did not turn away. Lord MacLaren did not step back. His chin lifted instead, in a gesture of almost proud defiance. "The agreement had to be fulfilled," he answered, not blinking. "Grace could not. Isla was the only option." Isla stiffened. Rowan felt a cold wave slide down the back of his neck. "The only option," Rowan repeated, each word cutting like a blade. "For whom?" Lord MacLaren hesitated, and in that brief moment, Rowan saw it. Shame, conflict, a man torn between duty and guilt. But Lord MacLaren was too proud to let weakness show for long. "For the clan," he said at last. "For all of us." Isla drew a trembling breath. Then she spoke, before Rowan could. "Father, you could have asked me," she said. Her voice was low but steady. "You could have come to me, looked me in the eyes and given me a choice. Instead, you decided for me. You put me inside a lie I barely had time to understand, a lie that still weighs on me every day." Her father's eyes met hers, hard at first, then starting to crack. "I did what I thought had to be done," he muttered. "Grace was everything. Losing her broke me more than I expected. I couldn't lose the agreement too. I couldn't lose anything else." Isla swallowed against a rising sob. Lady MacLaren's hand closed around her husband's arm, as if she too could feel the fracture. Rowan drew a careful breath and kept his voice firm. "What was done cannot be undone. The wedding happened. The lie happened. But now," he leaned forward a fraction, "now I intend to set this right, cleanly, clearly, and lawfully." Lord MacLaren straightened. "What is it your Grace wants, then?" Rowan let the answer fall like a stone into still water. "I want the marriage to Grace MacLaren annulled, as the bride was deceased, and I want to marry Isla MacLaren, under her true name, with true vows, before God and the law." Isla caught a soft, startled breath. Lady MacLaren's hand flew to her chest. Lord MacLaren went pale, though he tried to hold his composure. "And you want to marry my daughter?" he asked, as if he could not quite believe it. Rowan did not look at him. He looked at Isla. "I do," he said, "because I choose her. Not because she was pushed on me, not because I had no choice, but because I wish to share my life with her." It was more than a statement. It was a vow. Isla went very still, as if moving might break the moment. Lord MacLaren looked from his daughter to the Duke, and for the first time, something in his face softened. Not much, but enough. "If that is what the two of you want," his voice faltered briefly, "then you have my consent." Lady MacLaren began to cry openly. Isla rose and embraced her mother first. Then she hesitated with her father, but he pulled her into a brief, stiff hug, one that somehow still carried something Isla had never thought she'd see in him: quiet remorse. The annulment, discreet, was completed 2 days later with documents drawn up by lawyers Rowan trusted. There was no audience, no spectacle. The law simply recorded what was already truth. Grace was dead. The initial ceremony had no standing. And so on a clear spring morning, Isla walked down the aisle of the chapel not as a replacement, not as her sister's shadow, not as a fraud, but as herself. Her hair fell in soft waves, adorned with tiny wildflowers. Her gown was light blue, airy as a breath. Her smile was timid at first, and then it grew when her gaze met Rowan's waiting at the altar. He was not a man who smiled often, but that day he did. He smiled fully. The Reverend began the formal vows, but Rowan raised a hand. "With your permission, Reverend, before the formal words, I'd like to say something." The priest nodded. Isla held her breath. Rowan took her hands, and when he spoke, his voice was low, grave, and gentle. "Isla." Her name felt lighter on his tongue this time. "When you walked into my life, you brought chaos I never expected, but you also brought something I had forgotten existed, hope. I was afraid of you at first. I was angry at what you represented. I was angry at myself for beginning to want anything." He drew in a long breath. "But of everything I have lost, of everything I have learned through pain, there is one thing I know for certain now. Love is not weakness. Love is a choice, and I choose you." Tears rolled freely down Isla's cheeks. She tightened her grip on his hands, fighting to steady her voice. "Rowan," she began, her words trembling but not breaking, "I never imagined I'd be here. I never imagined being chosen. I spent so long believing I was less than Grace, less than what was expected, less than enough. But you saw me. You saw the woman beneath the mask, and still, you stayed. So today, I promise something simple. I promise to try every day to be someone worthy of that choice. I promise to stand beside you, even when fear tells me to run. I promise to be honest. And I promise to love you, not in spite of your scars, but with them." The priest resumed the ceremony. When he finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Rowan did not hesitate. He pulled her gently by the waist and kissed her with reverence and certainty. It was a kiss that sealed not only a marriage, but their redemption. Lady McLaren sobbed outright. Lord McLaren cleared his throat more than once. Mrs. Abernathy smiled, as though she had been waiting for this longer than anyone knew. Rowan cupped Isla's face when they parted. "Now," he murmured, "it's true." "Completely." Isla smiled through her tears. "It always was," she whispered. "We just needed to admit it." The simple meal that followed was warm, intimate, full of genuine laughter. Later, Isla and Rowan slipped away to the gardens, as they had done quietly so many evenings before. Spring was beginning to show in the young rose bush's first tight buds. "It's blooming," Isla said, kneeling beside it. "So are we," Rowan replied, kneeling beside her. Isla laid her hand over his. It was no longer possession, no longer fear, no longer distance. It was choice. "Rowan?" she asked, almost shyly. "Yes?" "Thank you for choosing me, for waiting for me, for doing everything right this time." He turned his hand and laced his fingers with hers. "I didn't do it alone," he answered. "You chose to stay, even when you could have walked away. That makes us equals." Isla smiled, a smile that lit her whole face. When Rowan kissed her, he did it without haste, without fear, with love, the kind of love that grows slowly, that survives storms, that returns like spring after a long winter. The kind of love that finally they both deserved. Epilogue, 2 years later. Isla woke to the first rays of sun slipping through the curtains and to the familiar sound of Rowan moving quietly around the room, doing his best not to wake her. She smiled with her eyes still closed, savoring that moment of peace before the day began. "I know you're awake," his amused voice murmured. She opened her eyes and found him already dressed, standing by the window. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the small mahogany cradle beside the bed, where their 3-month-old daughter slept soundly. You watch her as if she might vanish, Isla said softly, rising and walking toward him. Sometimes I still don't believe she's real, Rowan admitted, slipping an arm around Isla's waist. That any of this is real. Little Grace, named in honor of the sister Isla had lost, shifted in her sleep, a tiny fist opening and closing. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, and already showed a temperament that made Mrs. Abernathy predict, with a knowing smile, that she would be just as wild as her mother. She is real, Isla whispered, resting her head against Rowan's shoulder. Just as we are. They stood there for a few precious moments, simply watching their daughter breathe, before the duties of the day began to call them from the doorway. Rowan had a meeting with the land stewards, and Isla had promised to visit the village with Mrs. Abernathy, something she now did regularly as a true duchess, earning the affection and respect of the people with her honesty and quiet generosity. Later, as Isla crossed the gardens toward the waiting carriage, she paused by the rosebush. It was magnificent now, covered in white and red blooms intertwined in a stunning pattern. The gardeners swore they had never seen a rosebush flower so abundantly. It's because they're loved, Rowan had told her when she mentioned it. Plants know when they're cared for. Isla brushed one of the petals gently, thinking of how everything had changed, how something born of lies and desperation had transformed into love, truth, and family. Grace would have been proud, she thought, proud of how Isla had turned her sacrifice into something beautiful. "Lady Isla?" called Mrs. Abernathy. "We're ready." Isla turned, but not before plucking 2 petals, one white, one red, perfect in their duality, like her and Rowan, opposites that had learned to belong. When she returned at dusk, Rowan was waiting for her in the gardens, baby Grace cradled in his arms. He smiled when he saw her, that rare, unguarded smile that still set her heart racing. "Welcome home," he said, and Isla knew, with absolute certainty, that this was where she belonged, not in the highlands of her childhood. Not in Grace's shadow, but here, in Clydesmore, beside the man who loved her not despite her imperfect past, but with it. Home. Finally, irrevocably, home.